Hello, BookTube. As you know, as I mentioned many times on this channel, June is home to a new BookTube event, June on the Range, which was created by Michael K Vaughan. I'm one of the hosts. There are a bunch of other great hosts. And the event is designed, as you might be able to tell from the name, to celebrate the Western genre, which was once the dominant fiction genre in the Western world and is now completely forgotten. No one reads Westerns anymore. Almost nobody does. There are a few Westerns, actual formulaic genre-loyal Western novels that come out every season, but they are small print runs, usually mass-market paperbacks, usually designed for a die-hard cadre of hold-on fans. Far different from what things were like 60 years ago, when Westerns dominated the fiction world and the box office and the TV. And there's a mite peck of trouble brewing over on June on the Range, largely due to a video that Michael K Vaughan made on an idle Sunday. he was a little bit bored and out of sorts on an idle Sunday and decided that he would attack my profession. He made a video called "Do We Even Need Book Critics?" I'll leave a link to it down below. And I'm going to respond to that video with a dedicated response of its own. This is not a response to that video. I have many things to say about do we even need book critics, but one of the details, one of the little parts of that video that came up really stuck in my craw. I have to exercise that little grain of grit, that little burr under the saddle, or it will drive me plumb loco. Because in the course of that video, it wasn't the main point that he was making, but in the course of that video, Michael K Vaughan raises a Western author that I have now tried a few times. I've made a few videos about this author, Nelson Nye, who was a prolific Western author for a long time, was also a book critic, and was in the generation that I'm referring to, that where Westerns were in a heyday, a fan favorite. For a long time he was. Wrote lots and lots of books. I read a book of his called Rafe. That wasn't good. It was dumb and hokey. It was ridiculously overwritten. It was trying to make me like a main protagonist simply because he has a smart mouth or a horse that he really likes or whatever. I thought that Rafe largely abandoned the duties of good novel writing. And I read another Nelson Nye novel that felt the exact same way. So I mentioned, this author and I aren't getting along. I think he might stink. So I'm going to give him a wide berth for the rest of June on the Range. There are plenty of other fish in the sea, plenty of other novelists to read who wrote Westerns, including people even more prolific than Nelson Nye. I didn't mean any fuss by that, but Michael K Vaughan, in his video, Do We Even Need Book Critics?, brings up Nelson Nye as one of a trio of authors that he says critics are fundamentally wrong about. And the critic that he has to be talking about is me. Has any other critic in the history of the world ever talked about Nelson Nye? I don't think so. He mentions in that video, he mentions a few things about Nelson Nye in that video, and I will get to some of those in my dedicated response. But one tossed-off thing in that video that he mentions really got at me because it's a big pet peeve of mine. I don't think Michael knew that. Although I mention it endlessly on this channel, but who in their right mind would watch my channel? So he might not know that. One of the things that he mentions about Nelson Nye is essentially, he doesn't use the word, but essentially that I, as a critic, was being unfair to him. Because the two books that I was going on about were late in his career when he may have been losing a step. And that bothers me, right? I brought that up on June on the Range when I was looking at Louis L'Amour, who also had a hugely prolific, long career. I was wondering, is it right for me to watch for that kind of slippage? Is it churlish of me to say that the Louis L'Amour who was writing books in the late 1950s was writing much better books than the Louis L'Amour who was writing books in the late 1990s? Is that churlish to point out? I didn't really think so, because that's just part of reading critically, is to notice when an author's work is changing. There's nothing sacred about it. You're not like you're betraying a friend. Although, the more Louis L'Amour novels that I read, the more I kind of did feel like I was betraying a friend to point that out, instead of drawing a diplomatic silence over it. But I don't know Nelson Nye from a plug nickel. I'm coming to him cold. I think I learned about him through Michael K Vaughan. And that should have been a tip-off for me that maybe this is a favorite author of his, and that maybe one should tread lightly, which we don't tend to do. We tend to wear our spurs right into the parlor in June on the Range. But when Michael K Vaughan, in his video, which had many other heresies involved, this wasn't the major one, but when he mentions that I picked 2 novels from late in Nelson Nye's career, that bugged me. Because that would, I mean, Michael didn't mean anything invidious by it, but that would mean that I'm being unfair as a critic. I don't like to be unfair as a critic, so I found another novel of Nelson Nye's. I found a novel that he wrote in the 1950s. That is 50 years before the end of his career. So he could not possibly have been losing a step when this book was written in the 1950s. I found this book, Riders by Night, and I read it. In his video, Do We Even Need Book Critics?, Michael K. Vaughan reads you a little of Nelson Nye in order to make a case for the wretched prose that he's producing. And since misery loves company, I thought I would read you a little of this as well. I'm not going to cherry pick. I'm going to read the way this book starts. And we're going to go on until we can't take it anymore. So this is how Riders by Night starts. I have it on the Kobo here, so I'll be looking down. Kurt Cardigan, big and riled and intolerant of obstacles, shifted his weight from one boot to the other and wished the goddamn stage would get a rattle on. He had wasted 2 hours in this furnace already, and not a dust on the whole damn horizon. Nothing but desert, sky, mountains seen through a shimmering film of heat that curled and crawled off the rough planks and broiled above the hoof-tacked streets in the blistering glare of the noonday sun. Tucson, you could have it. He was a yellow-haired man in a trail-grimed clothing with a spatter of dust streaked across granite features. A steel-gray glance that was like chilled lightning snapped from under his sun-bleached brow and considered the view with no leavening of charity. His long, solid ups pinched in at the corners, and impatience lifted his burly shoulders and swung him about in the stage office doorway. Irritation danced from each clank of his spurs, and the high-heeled boots took him back to the counter. Butterfield will have to do better than this, or the government will take the damn mails away from him. That's Kurt Cardigan speaking. I have no idea who he's referring to, and I don't know what an ups is either, but we'll move on. The agent looked up with tired apology. He brushed damp hair back away from his forehead with fingers that left a smudge of ink in their wake. We're not often this late. By God, you're plenty late now. That's a pretty rough stretch between here and El Paso. A lot of up and down country around Dragoon Springs. Terrible lot of them Indians. He knew all that when he bid in the contract. The agent's flushed. His cheeks flushed, but his eyes fell away from the big man's look, and he picked his pen with a shrug of the shoulders. I'd hurry it for you if I could, Mr. Cardigan. Cardigan's answer to that was a snort. He wheeled, turned away, clanking back to the door, and again, with his legs firmly planted under him, sent his testy stare over the empty miles that spread, dun and tawny, to the faraway pass that cut through the mountains. That was the way the stage must come, if it did come. And if it didn't come soon, he'd go out and hunt. Or would he? He didn't know, by God, whether he would or not. There were times when he thought it couldn't get here quick enough. There were others when he'd get to mulling round in his mind and call himself 40 kinds of a fool and wish he could send that damn woman back. First you hear of a woman. She's on the stage. He didn't know, by grab, whether he wanted her or not. He reckoned a man didn't know his own luck. Take himself, Kurt Cardigan, a man used to backing it, I think. Everything going along just as fine as silk till he got that goddamn itching for a woman. He could easily get himself any number of squaws, but he just couldn't stomach the stink and the grease of them. We're going to push on. He wasn't no darn Mexican. Again, we're going to push on. What he wanted was a white woman, and none of your goddamn floozies either. It was the sight of that Nestor Rickoven's daughter that had got it all started and choosed him up a bit. He'd been doing all right till he run into her. He'd been passing their shack a mite early one morning. The old man was away, gone to town or something. He'd been following the creek, it being the shorter way, and had come out onto her without a rag on her. She'd been poised on that ledge at the pool by the waterfall. The noisy rush of the water, the pine needles, or something. He guessed his horse hadn't made much sound. He had sat there, struck dumb, scared to open his mouth even. Plump she was, and red-headed, with the skin of her body white as fresh milk. When he'd finally woke up, he'd got the hell out of there. But he hadn't forgot her, nor the look of her body with her hands trying to cover it, nor the man-fearing staring at him out of her eyes. So we're told when he finally woke up, he got the hell out of there. But she did see him. It's not like he left the way he came. She knew that someone was looking at her. And we don't know if he was only looking. We have no idea. If we can forget that detail. But anyway, let's move on. You'd kind of think that the thought of him having that body, well, it wasn't anything that could should have made a man hate her. But it made Cardigan hate her. It filled his head with an unreasoning anger, and it still could do it every time he thought of her. While he'd been riding and sweating and risking everything he'd ever hoped for the choking dust and heat of this hellhole, luckier guys had gone and got them a woman like that. Double-breasted doodads with creamy, smooth bodies that washed themselves and smelled sweet and purty. Every time he thought of it, it made him curse. He'd been ripe for trouble, for almost any fool thing, when that daffy Jupe Crayler had shown him the paper with the heart and hand column he'd got off the Tombstone stage. Cardigan hadn't hardly dared believe his own eyes. All them women wanted to come out here? Why the hell would a stall-fed eastern filly, with every last thing you'd expect him to howl for, want to come out to this godforsaken country? It didn't make sense. But they did. There'd been 3 of them in that column about fairly frothing at the mouth to get themselves out here. Seemed like all they wanted was a man to take care of them. Some of them even offered to send on their tintypes, and 2 of them had claimed to have character references, like as if he cared about their characters. So this is mail-order brides, basically. He saw an ad for mail-order brides in a newspaper in Tombstone. He'd come near to tearing that damn paper up. He'd been as disgusted to come on it as late. A St. Louis paper nearly 6 weeks old. Any fool could have told you any woman in her senses wouldn't have passed up chances for a whole 6 weeks, not without by grab there'd been something ailing her. But the thought of those women wouldn't let him alone. 3 of them eating their hearts out to get here, and him, Kurt Cardigan, feeling so horny he was just about ready to climb on a squaw. Again, we're going to push on. He'd waited till the rest had rolled up for the night, till he couldn't hear another damn thing, but their snoring. Then he'd crept from his blankets and hunted that paper, had found it too, and had tucked it away where he'd have it handy to study over when he got off alone. He could still remember how his hands had shook smoothing out that paper when he'd found the right page again. It was just like he'd been in a shaken fever, and he'd thought he'd never hold it still enough to read it. One of the women didn't want to leave town. 3 or 4 local sports, gents with property, fellers with a business. A couple more which had wanted to come west didn't sound like nothing he would want. But the other one, damn. He could still quote her words. Quote, refined young lady, vivacious, 23, despising cold toast, cuckoo clocks, and close relatives, desires correspondence with brown-eyed rancher, preferably one living west of the Pecos. Object, matrimony. Address, Miss Dosey Ballinet, 5486 Rimbold Street, St. Louis, Missouri. Dosey Ballinet, just like Dosey Doe in a brush popper's hoedown. Dosey, by God, it even sounded like class. That's probably quite enough, don't you think? That is the opening of Riders by Night. And the novel goes on. Dosey is on that stage, or supposed to be. But it is so intolerably late that eventually Kurt Cardigan goes out looking for it and finds trouble. He finds that it has been waylaid. He is shot by one of the people who waylays it. And in the course of the novel, as I think you would expect, he falls in love, grudgingly, with the woman that he has bought. Rescues her, gets involved in a complicated plot about what is chasing her and what she might be fleeing from, and eventually comes to recognize her as a sort of quasi-human, as someone that he can have about as much affection for as he would a good hunting dog. And that is Riders by Night, which came out in the 1950s. Now let's think about that opening that I read. That's how the book opens. That sets the stage, so to speak. No pun intended. And if we overlook the shrieking racism and sexism that is just everywhere in there. I mean, the racism is particularly hard to overlook in that passage. It doesn't get any better in the course of the novel, and it wasn't something that I really noticed in the first two books that I read by this author, which, as Michael K. Vaughan points out, were much later in his career, when maybe he'd had to think about some of the dime store Western stereotypes that he was aping. Maybe he'd sat down and thought, well, you know, I know some people who maybe it's not right to have my main character, the person we're supposed to like, the hero of the story, talking about climbing up on a squaw if only he could hold his nose against the smell and the grease. That kind of writing. I'm not being puritanical, and I don't mean to judge the work by any of the prejudices that the author either held or was imitating. But if we look past that, if we overlook those parts, not 100% sure they should be overlooked, but if we overlook them, what do we get still? A low-brow, idiotic brute of a man who, in the course of this novel, he gets hit a few times really hard, he gets shot a few times really close. He's a steady hand in those situations. He knows what he wants. He gets what he wants. He has the force majeure that guides so many of, for instance, Louis L'Amour's heroes, where, in addition to being the best man in the story, morally, personally, they're also the most formidable man in the story, plain and simple, no matter what, even if the other man is twice their size, as we saw in for instance, The Outlaw Trail, where the main character, in the opening pages, utterly dismantles a man twice his size. It doesn't matter. It's the skill, it's the force of the main character involved. Well, Kurt Cardigan is that main character, but he has no nobility. He has nothing in the way of an interior life. He is largely, I won't use incendiary words, but he is largely a creature. The only way that Nelson Nye could have expected that his readers would like Kurt Cardigan enough to read the story long enough to wait for him to assume any elements of humanity would be if those readers liked what they saw in those opening pages. If they thought, here's a hard hero, here's a hero I can sort of sidle up to and like. And I'm not blaming Nelson Nye for this. Not 100%. In his video, Do We Even Need Book Critics, Michael K. Vaughan implies that Nelson Nye was writing to a market. And that if the market was fervid and overwritten with purple prose and slang and whatnot, and if that Nelson Nye would write those books. And by extension, if the market was full of Kurt Cardigan type characters, big, brutish, horrible men without a single thing to recommend them, without a single redeeming character trait. If the novels viewed the very idea of character traits as kind of suspect, Eastern doodah type suspect stuff, and that out here in the West we don't deal with any of that kind of stuff, well, then Nelson Nye would write that kind of book. I don't really know that myself. That kind of a theory, that my author isn't bad, he's just writing bad, is kind of unfalsifiable, right? It's like Santa Claus. There's really no way to know unless you were to create telepathic contact with Nelson Nye when he was at his writing desk. But the one thing that I'll say in Michael K. Vaughan's defense, and maybe as a criticism myself, judging the author's whole works on the basis of those two later novels that I read, is something that I think you can see in that excerpt that I read you, which is that, especially if you compare it both to the excerpt that not so much to the excerpt that Michael K. Vaughan reads in his own video, but also to the excerpt that I read of a later book from this author, the prose is more controlled. There's a lot less cartooniness in it. Some cartooniness shows up in this novel, especially there are a couple of major action sequences, and oh my God, Nelson Nye. I don't know much about this author, not personally, but I gather from those action sequences that he never heard a gun fired in anger. But aside from those instances where that kind of overwritten, hysterical, adolescent purple prose starts to work its way in around the edges, this is much more controlled. It's much more even atmospheric. There are a couple of good turns of phrase in that rather odious passage that we read. So Michael K. Vaughan might have had a point. This author might have lost a step or two later in his career. But although he might have had a point, this book didn't do anything to really rattle my original idea that maybe this is not a good author. I mean, what am I supposed to do? Here it's one thing if it's my experiment with Louis L'Amour, where I am dropping depth charges at many different points in a long writing career and finding good stuff every single time. It's a very different thing if I'm dropping those depth charges now 2 books relatively near the end of his career, and 1 book no one could say is near the end of his career, and finding stuff that's not only wretched to read, but wretched in a lot of its ideas and a lot of its personal stances. If that's true, I don't know how many more chances I need to give this author. However, in the spirit of amity, so that peace can descend over Rancho June on the Range, I will give this author another try. I will pick a novel maybe 2 or 3 years after this one at the end of the month. The month is halfway done. I'll pick another Nelson Nye. I don't want no trouble. I don't want no fuss. So I will pick another Nelson Nye. But in the meantime, that is my June on the Range update for today. And you would think that if this much fur is flying, the last thing I would want to do is read another author that Michael K. Vaughan recommends, right? Because even if I legitimately don't like that author, it's still going to cause bad blood. Nevertheless, there are no Hatfields and McCoys here at June on the Range. That we're saving the internecine squabbles between hosts for Garb August. That is coming. Me against the world. But in this case, I am going to try. I'm going to go back. Michael K. Vaughan did a great video about Westerns that he really likes, authors that he really likes. I think that's where I learned about Nelson Nye, and I learned about a few other people there, too, that have been institutions in Westerns that I haven't read. I'm going to go back and try those in the spirit of amity. So there you go. That is Showdown in Nye-Town. I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.